Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights.
We just believed in Mr. Randolph. Nobody couldn't tell us, me especially, against Mr. A. Phillips. Nobody.
And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway. And just as
throughout the 20th century, A. Philip Randolph stood at the leading edge of social and political change. In the 1950s, he challenged union bosses, demanding equality for black workers.
But we do know that
A. Philip Randolph did more than anyone to set the agenda for the modern civil rights movement.
In the 40s, he faced down 2 presidents to end segregation in defense industries and in the military. In the 20s and 30s, he led black workers in a fight against a powerful corporation.
the very nature of the struggle on the part of labor and minority.
And in 1919, the Attorney General called him the most dangerous Negro in America.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist, the technician of anarchy, David Griscom.
How's it going?
And everybody else, all of the crew and team in the TMBS universe on this week's program. Justice denied again to political prisoner Lula da Silva, but progress in the fight back in Brazil. We're going to be talking with Brian Mier of Brazil Wire and Telesur. Also doing a media critique of U.S. corporate media, but also some alternative media as well. Then Harvey J. returns. We're talking about Bernie Sanders, A. Philip Randolph, Eugene Debs, and this American tradition of social democracy, that even if we are standing in politics that is significantly to the left of that, the fact that Bernie Sanders is reclaiming it and articulating it is another way in which he is the only candidate that is a serious choice for a left position in this race. We're going to be talking about that, the Wisconsin uprising, the origins of the DLC and the third way, the always bad career of Joe Biden. Plus, we have a gem from Griscom and a shout out. You know what it is. Absolutely incredible plan by Bernie Sanders to eliminate student debt. This will help millions and millions and millions of people, getting them out from under this predatory system with no wonkery, no bullshit, just the stroke of a pen. Get rid of that debt. No nonsense. All that. Plus, of course, a jam-packed postgame. We're looking at the escalating crisis in Iran. President Rouhani getting spicy on Donald Trump. And a bad Pete Buttigieg. Not good. All that. And plus, we'll start to engage with what's happening in the Western Sahel and much, much more on the Michael Brooks Show. But first, we want to update you as best we can with what's happening in the Sudan, while uprisings continue in citizen-led labor union and youth-oriented movements to complete a revolutionary change. This process began in 2018 with civilian protests across the country protesting against Omar al-Bashir, a military strongman who had led Sudan for 30 years. There were many objections that students, activists across ethnic and religious divides and labor unions had against Omar al-Bashir. These protests, though, were spurred in the main because of austerity and cuts and price increases on essential goods. Those protests were successful. That led to a military-led coup that ousted Bashir a couple of months ago, but not to civilian transfer. This was the lesson of so many of the uprisings that emanated from 2011 in the Middle East. Not an exact parallel, but of course the tragic lessons of Egypt were a revolutionary action that was completed by the military when they basically removed Mubarak from power. They allowed an election to take place eventually, putting the Muslim Brotherhood in power. Morsi, of course, was now dead after a ruthless coup backed in part by Israel and others. And of course, while we're no fans of the Muslim Brotherhood, we do recognize that the fact that just within years of a revolutionary movement against sort of neoliberal autocracy, the fact that Egypt is even more authoritarian and brutal under the leadership of al-Sisi is an incredible catastrophe. The Sudanese people, of course, knew this, so they stayed on the streets. The military eventually reacted. On June 3rd, the Khartoum massacre group, the RSF, which stands for Rapid Support Forces, a group killed at least an estimated 128 protesters. They raped women. They dumped bodies in the Nile to hide that total number. The Rapid Defense Forces were developed out of the Janjaweed, the group responsible for war crimes and genocide in Darfur. In response, the Sudanese Professional Association called for civil disobedience and a general strike that was widely successful. Protests continue against military and paramilitary forces and barricading of roads. On the June 12th, the SPA and the Freedom and Change Alliance, which represents the pro-democracy movement, suspended the general strike in order to resume negotiations in response to a military council release of political prisoners. The African Union and Ethiopia have been pushing for negotiations over the weekend, and a roadmap that would include 15-member council, 8 civilian and 7 military, would lead the transition, according to the latest reporting from the Associated Press. The key question, of course, is what is, in fact, the military in this conflict? We know that the military should not be ruling Sudan, but in fact, between the paramilitary and the military itself, there's different factions. The military is not one cohesive force. There's a struggle between the Sudanese military and paramilitary forces. The leader of the RSF, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, also known as Hamedi, has solidified a lot of power over the past couple of months. He's culpable not only for war crimes in Darfur, but in the last couple of years, after drawing huge condemnation from European powers and the United States, including an international indictment of Omar al-Bashir for war crimes, the EU has made deals with the RSF and helped with in terms of blocking migrants from entering the Mediterranean. So this same genocidal paramilitary has worked with European Union powers to block migrants from getting to EU territory. The RSF is also fighting under the Saudi campaign of genocide in Yemen. The international situation is such that RSF, as I mentioned, is backed by the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Egypt is supporting the military council as well. And the RSF has profited immensely from war in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pledged $3 billion to stabilize Sudan's economy. However, the people have power. The Sudanese people have been resolved and fearless and continue to do so, regardless of the brutality of the regime and the paramilitary forces. To show solidarity with Sudan, we must highlight Sudanese voices and struggle while highlighting the financial and political international apparatus that wants to keep people under military dictatorship. It was very trendy several years ago to talk about the crimes committed by Omar al-Bashir and the Janjaweed, and rightfully so, even though some of that discourse obscured the complicated political and regional dynamics of Sudanese politics. But in the last couple of years, Bashir has worked his way back into something approaching some type of rapprochement, at least with the Europeans, and obviously the Trump administration has no regard for human life in general, even above and beyond the usual relentless disregard for human life by U.S. foreign policy. This is a bottom-up action generated by a democracy movement, by students, by labor unions. This is fundamentally bottom-up African politics. It's time that we account for and follow it in the same way when it could be a projection of so-called humanitarian impulses from the West. All right. Do you guys have anything you want to jump in on that?
I mean, it's been very exciting. The success of the general strike, of just the coordination that we've seen in Sudan has been really important. Definitely. And another thing too, to just warn against, it's very popular in the West. Don't fetishize technology over people's movements, right? So even though people are using social media to highlight their voices, they're doing it because of the social forces and incredible organizing on the ground, not because, oh, how lucky are these people because they now have Facebook because the United States gave it to them.
In fact, not only that, I mean, look at it in a smart way. I mean, Sudan under Omar al-Bashir in 2011, I remember the reports were that the Sudan were, because of course, I mean, the uprisings that moved through the Middle East and North Africa in that time period in places like Tunisia and Egypt and so on, it affected Sudan, and there were uprisings in Sudan. The Sudanese were pioneers in using social media events to generate fake protests as a means to disrupt movements and hand over protesters to the intelligence services. So absolutely, this is about people power, and the technology is always secondary to that, without a doubt. That's a very good point. Let's get to the shout out, guys. I'm looking for a remix. Obviously, Danarchy is the genius behind most of the music. I would like a Dave Rubin shout-out remix that we could get into rotation. I think that could be funny. I could see something about high-level ideas and the idea thermometer, potentially, facilitating the shout-out.
Yeah, well, I mean, we should think about the what do we want for like a form of this shout out? Do we want it to be a shorter one where it's like, this is the shout out, and it's like an 8-minute thing, or do we want another song?
Wait, 8-minute thing?
Or 8-second thing?
Okay.
Or do we yes.
I don't know about an 8-minute thing.
Or do we want another song that we kind of stare at the camera through?
Well, I think we want another song that we stare at the camera through and probably talk over for a little bit. But I like the option, and I think you should just record that, Matt. You should just go, and now the shout out presented by TMBS.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see.
I think you just did it, buddy.
And now the shout out on TMBS.
And now some news from the positive side of the equation from TMBS.
And now some people you don't have to be mad at.
Yeah, and now some things you can be happy about. And now an indigenous tribe beating an oil company, or a teenager throwing a milkshake at a prick. It's the shout out. All right, let's do it.
To the shout out, creepy, shout out, weird. I think that's
it's still
creepy.
So funny.
It's creepy.
Oh yeah, I mean it's Jesus fucking Christ. Bernie Sanders, incredible move. I mean, let's really take in what this will do. I'll put this on the table. This will change my life fundamentally. I've drowned in student debt since coming out of college, and for several years was absolutely in default with all the appendages of affecting one's credit score and so on. This is something that affects millions of people, students, young people, parents. It's a form of economic terrorism. And in addition to being absolutely morally wrong, it's an incredible shackle on the economy. This is the pattern of this campaign. Frankly, irrelevant candidate with a very bad record and little to no presence like Julian Castro will release a sort of attempt to grab some headlines and a sort of very narrow bureaucratic package, which would be a slight improvement, but nothing on the scale of the problem. Elizabeth Warren will produce a good plan that will benefit a lot of people, but has unnecessary complexity, bureaucracy, and its own attendant problems. Bernie Sanders coming out and saying, let's just wipe this out, have free college, and move forward. This is incredibly positive. The amount of human suffering this would relieve and human potential that this would open is hard to overstate. Let's play a clip of this from Bernie's campaign.
If we could bail out Wall Street, we sure as hell can reduce student debt in this country.
I owe $57,000. $58,000 in student debt.
I've got over $32,000.
I'm not even quite sure how much I owe in student debt. It's gotten to the point where it's almost scary to look at.
It's crippling an entire generation of people. It's just not right. This is like America. We have the right to like these huge big dreams, you know, the picket fence, the house, and that's just not what our current system allows.
Part of what people look for when they come from their home countries, like my family did, is an opportunity to get an education. That's what my father came here for.
This is incredibly powerful stuff. And again, there isn't even a lot that needs to be elaborated here. I mean, it's self-evident that this would make millions and millions, potentially tens of millions of people's lives radically better out of the gate. It would also have a significant spillover effect in terms of things like home purchases, business startups, and all sorts of social value that, of course, isn't measured by things like GDP, although it would certainly be good for GDP. We need to broaden out this Jubilee concept. In fact, this is a mistake. I should have included this in Roundup. I tweeted out congratulating the Sanders campaign, and I said medical debt should be next. And Josh Orton, who's an advisor for Sanders, tweeted back at me with a thinking face emoji, which I take as a positive signal that they're thinking in these terms as well. Of course, I would globalize it. I want to see complete debt relief for the Caribbean. I want to see debt relief packages for all countries that have been victim of World Bank and IMF plans, as an example. But this is an incredible step and another significant sense. I mean, Pramila Jayapal, when she was announcing the work on this bill with Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, and AOC, and Randy Weingarten, she said, look, in 2015, no one else was centering this crisis on the federal level. Bernie Sanders was. So now in 2020, we have all of these other candidates, some sincerely, I think some not sincerely, catching up on the template that Bernie Sanders has created. We're going to talk to Bill Fletcher Jr. And do another strategy session with him for patrons this weekend for the primer. But he's making the point that, you know, the Democratic Party has already moved left in terms of policy and rhetoric. That's been achieved emanating out of the social movements in Sanders' campaign. The next step is, how do you actually start to win actual victories? And once again, we see just a completely different level of escalation and commitment here. So shout out to the Sanders campaign. If you are affected by student debt, you should be thrilled. This is by far the best plan. If you paid off your student debt and you feel sulky about this, well, one, don't be a petty motherfucker.
The economy is clearly working for you.
Yeah. And if you precisely, and by the way, it will work even better for you. There is nothing but benefits in this in terms of the amount of social capital and economic activity. And if you're worried about higher earners, which you shouldn't be, because frankly, look, oligarchs aren't affected by this stuff to begin with. But there are even people who are, relatively speaking, very privileged, and they wouldn't deny it themselves. They have medical degrees, law degrees, whatever. They're still having a huge amount of their incomes eaten up by this. And that is bad for them, and it's bad for the economy, regardless of where they are in the economic spectrum.
Do you know how many jobs for public relations agencies I would have applied to if student loans weren't part of my calculation after college?
I'm going to guess zero.
Zero. I would not have. And
right.
I don't mean to insult anybody in those professions, but it is professional line, and the relationship from that industry versus journalism in terms of number of people employed in it is a very scary thing. Like, freeing people from the necessity of serving corporate interests is a good thing.
Less corporate lawyers, less PR people, or people
people
practicing PR or law on behalf of justice, on behalf of movements, whatever. I mean, you know, and again, this is where people get so pedantic and stupid, like, oh, we're going to relieve corporate lawyers of their debt. And as Bree Joy pointed out, our friend and now Bernie press secretary, she's like, I wouldn't have become a corporate lawyer if this wasn't an issue. So you can eliminate the problem before it starts.
I literally thought about driving truck in North Dakota in the oil fields.
Of course.
It made a lot of sense at the time.
Absolutely. All right, let's do a little pitch, and then we're going to get to our friend Brian Mier of Brazil Wire and Telesur. Did you guys get, I guess we'll include it next week, but there's a great document I shared with you that has now all of the illicit histories and idea primers listed. And over the next couple of weeks, if you're following all of us on Twitter, you can find the various ways. And also, we have an Instagram page set up now, right?
Yeah, we're working on getting that launched soon.
Okay, so the Instagram page will be launched soon. We're going to start giving you a lot of little video clips from the main show, but also some audio clips and other things from the illicit histories and idea primers, and also probably some of the fun post-game stuff as well. But you, again, as I say every week, and we're going to start spelling out into more detail next week, a global political education on theory, on history, on the main events shaping your life, and also maybe places that you haven't necessarily thought about but are fascinating and actually do affect your life. From Turkish social democratic politics, Iran, obviously, Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil. Then the other thing that we're really excited about, and that's really significant, for 21 and above patrons, Comrade and above patrons, we have our new video, Illicit Histories. And what we do, we're going to actually have the second one be released for the public on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days with Jamila Mishner on Medicaid, civil rights, and the states' rights scam. The first one with Bill Fletcher Jr. on the Rainbow Coalition is already there. And as an example, Ryan Grimm, who just wrote an incredible book on this stuff, was like, that was awesome. So, and the one that just got released for patrons yesterday, Milton Alamati on the Congo and Patrice Lumumba. These are incredibly high quality pieces. And so when you're at a $21 level patron, you get one of those a month. You help us pick and curate content. And then you get 1 or 2 group phone calls a month with me. Then, of course, there's the Discord group. So there's a huge amount of content. We're going to actually do much more to sort of spell out and fill in what that is. We are now at the phase, we just had a huge spike in the last week of the tickets we've sold for our Chicago live show. So I'd go grab your tickets today, August 24th, Tavern Hall in Chicago. That's going to be fun. Left is Best hits the Midwest.
Love Chicago.
What'd you say?
I love Chicago.
It's a great place. All right, we're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Brian Mier. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is our friend and comrade, Brian Mier. He is co-founder, co-editor of the Brazil Wire. He's also a reporter for Telesur. Brian, thanks so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me, man.
Brian, so a lot to get to. Obviously, we've been following from the beginning of this show, actually, in fact, and before the political imprisonment of Lula, we've been following this case very closely with you. And obviously spoke recently with Glenn Greenwald about this. Just, basically, I mean, very important reporting in the Intercept that validates what was always analytically clear from, your reporting and analysis. What happened today in the Brazilian Supreme Court, and, where are we at in terms of the fight to free Lula? But obviously the fight to free Lula, I mean, it's huge in and of itself, but this is central to the battle against Bolsonaro, and by extension, I would say the whole global battle against all of this, neoliberalism and authoritarianism.
Yeah, I agree on your take on that. Well, today, 2 habeas corpuses that were filed by Lula's defense team, Valesca Martins and Cristiano Martins. The first one, they were deliberated on by the Supreme Court. And so the first one was based on an attempt to reverse his imprisonment. As you, I'm sure, remember, he was imprisoned through an arbitrary decision by the Supreme Court, which violated the Brazilian Constitution, that enabled them to put him in jail before his appeals processes were fully played out. And so the first habeas corpus that they filed was to overturn his imprisonment and allow him to remain in freedom until his next appeals come up and are deliberated on and all that. And they voted that down, 4-1. The second was much more interesting, and people thought there was a much bigger chance of it being approved. And that was based on the argument that Sergio Moro was not an impartial judge in the process. And there's a mountain of evidence that shows that to be the case. Even before the intercepts, revelations of the leaked social media chats, talking about with Sergio Moro talking with the prosecution team, giving them instructions on how to keep the PT from winning the elections last year. Before that, even, we had the simple fact that Sergio Moro accepted the position of justice minister in the government of the man who he helped elect by removing his biggest opponent from the race. That should be enough to have all the charges thrown out. They'd be thrown out in other countries. And so there was a lot of hope for that happening. But what they did was they ruled that they're going to postpone the ruling until after their vacation, which means that they won't get back to it until August. And Cristiano Zanin, who's one of Lula's defense lawyers, filed an emergency motion to allow Lula to stay in freedom until they made that decision in August, but they rejected that too. So he's still in jail. And it's worth noting that some of the leaked social media conversations from Telegram already show Sergio Moro and his head prosecutor, Dalton Dalignol, talking about how friendly they were with one of the Supreme Court justices and talking about how much they hated the Supreme Court Justice Teori, who was killed in a helicopter accident one day before he was supposed to rule on Lava Jato. He was in charge of ruling on that on the case, and he had serious issues with Moro. He didn't think Moro was qualified to rule on the investigation. All right, so the expectation is that a lot more is going to be released about the relationship between Lava Jato and the Brazilian Supreme Court. And of course, we also have, this great new documentary out on Netflix now. I think it's called The Edge of Democracy in English. I don't know, but they play audio in which a senator and a former cabinet minister are talking about making a big deal with the Supreme Court to impeach Dilma.
Yep.
So there's just going to be more and more evidence coming out, I think, about collusion between the Supreme Court and Lava Jato. So it's almost in their best interest to just let Lula out of jail, I guess, but who knows what's going on.
Is it possible that they're reticent to do that? I mean, again, it's funny because I'll accept the rap. I obviously, and Lula's not the only one. There's some politicians I do in fact like, but Lula, there is a part of this conversation that, take somebody that I am not a fan of. So, Bill Clinton has political talent, right? Some of these things are just objective. So Lula is an incredible political communicator to the point where, one of the things that's so kind of comical, and it would be very comical if it wasn't so sick and they weren't imprisoning this man and this whole process wasn't happening, is that, these people are they've already imprisoned him. They've already made the 2018 elections illegitimate. They've already taken him off the playing field. They're having conniptions and a meltdown about him doing a radio or television interview before the vote for Haddad. And, as you pointed out, and Glenn Greenwald pointed out, maybe rightfully so. This guy could flip, public opinion with potentially one or two interviews. There's no doubt in my mind that the fact that they've allowed him to do some speaking the last, couple of weeks even has definitely been sort of part of this process. And so when this is combined with the fact that Bolsonaro is incompetent, hugely unpopular, there's social movements taking place across the country. At the same time, every day you hear a new initiative to, more pesticides are being introduced into the environment. They're moving forward on pension reform, so-called pension reform, and all these other, the Wall Street-driven austerity measures. Is there some sense that even if you're taking the blows, you can't let this leader out of prison, at the very least, until the whole point of all of this, going back to the impeachment of Dilma, other than people covering their own asses, but the actual policy agenda is completed?
Yeah, I think that that's part of it. And I know that international capital is really pushing for these ultra neoliberal pension reforms because it would open up private sector management of the retirement funds for over 100 million Brazilians, really. That's a lot of money. It's still the second biggest economy in the Americas. And this is why you have The Guardian and all these other newspapers cheerleading for these pension reforms. And the resistance is so strong against them that Michel Temer was unable to pass them after they had 2 general strikes that paralyzed the country, paralyzed large parts of the country, and they're having a really hard time getting them passed right now. So I feel like there's definitely international pressure. And now let's not forget that when the last round of Intercept leaks were published last week, and with this Supreme Court deliberation coming up today, Sergio Moro and his former, head prosecutor of Lava Jato, Dalton Dalignol, both flew up to the U.S. for 5 days of meetings with U.S. intelligence agencies. Mm-hmm. And, my comment at the time was like, the first thing they must have said is, take a look at our phones. What's the problem?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Can you give us some new encryption software? Exactly. Well, I think, and I just want to also highlight this to continue on that thread of the outside pressure. If you look at Lava Jato, and I know Lula looks at it this way, and certainly the Brazil Wire always covered it this way, as you have this independent unit, which is given this incredible power to go after quote unquote corruption. And we'll get to that in a minute when we talk about media failures. And I think corruption discourse is one of the most problematic and dangerous things in terms of beating the right in today's world and actually having an analysis of capitalism and not just moralism. But you have this unit, they're set up. They have this one-dimensional, they have this corruption focus. Okay, then it's clear that it's weaponized and it's aimed at the Workers' Party. And one of the other Intercept leaks shows, as an example, that Sergio Moro smacks down the idea of going after Enrique Cardozo, another former president, saying like, we can't investigate him. He's basically a powerful ally of ours. Then you connect this to 2012 when the Snowden revelations, which is funny, Greenwald's other sort of great accomplishment of revealing NSA spying. The NSA was aggressively spying on Petrobras and Dilma's decision. And what you've done with these state companies is Lava Jato's basically destroyed these huge Brazilian strategic assets and a lot of jobs.
Yeah, definitely. Just in 2015 alone, when they were destabilizing the economy to lead up for throwing out Dilma Rousseff, there was a study done that was published in BBC Brazil, which showed that the paralyzation of Brazil's 5 largest construction companies, which Sergio Moro ordered because of corruption charges, that alone caused 500,000 direct job losses, plus over 1 million of indirect job losses. And it caused a 2.5% drain on the GDP growth that year. So that year, there was a 3.8% negative GDP growth. It was a recession. But 2.5%, over half of that was caused directly because of this anti-corruption investigation, because they refused to treat Brazil's most important companies as too big to fail. Instead, they destroyed them. Well, that helped destabilize Dilma Rousseff's government. It helped lead to the rise of the right. Really,
And also, it did all of that, and it also, it definitely. I mean, this was another major, and it's not radical. I mean, this was part of PT functioning successfully within the global context of that time, which is that they use these companies not only to create a lot of jobs, which are incredibly important, obviously, but they use them as sort of mid-sized overseas investment vehicles to generate money, which they then invested back in social programs, which of course was part of the reason that they had such incredible accomplishments with reducing poverty. I mean, there's a great clip from several years ago of the economist, friend of this show, Mark Blythe, at Brown, basically saying that, oh yeah, the Lula Dilma formula is amazing. This is the plan. They use these companies to basically funnel investment into social programs. It's like the winning formula of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning that the U.S. Navy reestablished the Southern Command, the Southern Fleet, like 6 months after they discovered these massive offshore pre-salt oil deposits. in Brazil, you know? So I'm sure those two things were obviously related to each other. But Dilma Rousseff, one of the last things she did, you know, before she was thrown out of office, maybe a year earlier, is that she issued a decree saying that 100% of the profits from the state petroleum company would be divided between public education and public health. You know, and it was at this point, Petrobras was maybe the second largest oil, you know, petroleum corporation in the world. I don't see Shell doing that, you know, like Shell's corrupt.
Right.
And Chevron and these other these petroleum companies have private mercenary armies killing indigenous people in the Amazon, or like caught on tape bragging about appointing cabinet ministers in Nigeria. It's not like they're squeaky clean, you know, as opposed to the corrupt state industry. But regardless, they're not pumping anything into social programs, really. You know, I know that petroleum's terrible and it's destroying the world and all of this, but if you're going to, you know, like rank different petroleum companies, you would think the state-run ones would at least have some kind of vested interest in the citizens of the country that they come from.
And they clearly did under the Workers' Party, under Lula and Dilma. I mean, the performance speaks for itself. I want to get to the media stuff in a minute, but I mean, can you also connect this? We've talked about it a little bit, but I'd like your take on it. I mean, is there another way of just looking at this, going back to the 2009 coup in Honduras and Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration's support for that, where this is also just the broader culmination of the push that really begins in earnest in the Obama administration, in fact, to just reverse the pink tide?
Definitely. And, you know, Brazil was always the prize because it's so much bigger than all the other countries in Latin America. You know, so Brazil was like the culmination of all of this, really, you know? I mean, yeah, there's still Venezuela. And I mean, the latest Southcom strategy says the hostile nations to the United States in the Americas are Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. So they're still going after them. But Brazil, economically, is just a powerhouse. And now that we've basically got a puppet regime in power doing everything that the U.S. asks them to, they got what they wanted.
Right. And even if it's, you know, embarrassing to some people because Bolsonaro is a bigot and a thug and an idiot, at the end of the day, it's sort of like the same, you know, it's the same way people like the Koch brothers will kind of, oh, you know, yeah, Donald Trump's really uncouth. Anyways, we'll take our tax breaks and environmental pollution now.
The day the U.S. corporations still have the oil, Boeing still has Embraer, aviation company, which it took over. Microsoft still has the Brazilian government converting all of their systems back to Windows, which were converted to Linux under Lula. And Monsanto's having a field day down here. So at the end of it, they don't care that much about Bolsonaro being uncouth, being a racist, sexist, rape culture promoter.
Right. Of course not. Even if it's, you know, temporarily embarrassing for a moment. So, you know, what was incredible was watching the press have to cover this after, you know, totally just underreporting this story in a way that was kind of shocking, just frankly, given, I mean, you know, again, I think, you know, there's really important Kurdish political prisoners in Turkey, which I've written about. We should talk more about probably. I mean, there's political prisoners across the world, obviously, and, you know, in various countries, and some backed by the United States, some backed by, you know, Russia or China, some in the United States, Russia or China, for that matter. But that being said, I mean, besides even just the moral part of it, I mean, Lula, because of Brazil's strategic importance and because of Lula's global stature, the amount, the sort of how little attention it got was really very stunning. And then when it did get attention, I mean, it was, you know, because I was in the Brazil Wire vortex, so I'd have the same, just, you know, I couldn't even read some just basic Guardian or New York Times dispatch because, you know, it would say Lula was convicted on money laundering charges. And of course, it's before you even get to disputing what he was convicted on, that wasn't what he was convicted on, right? Like just these basic elementary misreporting of this stuff all the time. And then the last couple of weeks, all of a sudden, you know, some places and sort of about faces of, oh, actually, it looks like maybe there was a conspiracy against him, or, you know, or raises questions, or, you know, or in the worst ones, you know, anti-corruption is under threat because Lava Jato has been revealed to be shockingly corrupt. can you just we're going to get to the alternative media in a couple of minutes and play some sound, but the Guardian, the New York Times, whoever, I mean, just talk about the incredible press failure on this story.
Okay, well, I think, you would expect like Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNN, and these very pro-business publications to always have been supporting, pro-corporate regime change in Brazil, because that represents the interests of the people who bankroll them, of the billionaire class. But I think it's especially disappointing to see these really insidious newspapers like the New York Times and the Guardian, which pretend that they're progressive, when they're dealing with national issues a lot of times. And they even give some space to actual leftists in the op-ed section and things like that, for them to just you can't call what they were writing about Brazil from 2014 forwards really actual reporting. It's just PR. Mm-hmm. It was all just regime change PR. And so I feel like they're just acting as members of, like what Gramsci used to call the integral state. I mean, the media is part of the government. The corporations are part of the government. They're all interrelated. They all have the same objectives, and they work together to establish a consensus to kind of like brainwash people so that they don't challenge, the government or capitalism. And I feel like it's just propaganda, because they're like, you get a paper like The Guardian, which used to have this really amazing reputation and everything, lying about what Lula was arrested for on the day he was arrested. They said his arrest was connected to a 49 million real Petrobras bribery scheme. And as horrible as Sergio Moro is, and he's obviously really bad, you can see now from the leaked audio, if you don't want to take my word for it, the leaked social media chats and audio that The Intercept is revealing, even Sergio Moro said in his conviction against Lula specifically that it had nothing to do with Petrobras Petroleum Company. Mm-hmm. But The Guardian went ahead and ran this story, And I mean, that's just like one example, but the entire time, even now with The Intercept revelations, they're trying to water it down. And they've been downplaying the size of all of the anti-Bolsonaro protests. They pretended that there were no anti-coup protests when Dilma was getting impeached. They lied about the size of those. They had 1.8 million people on the streets on May 15th protesting Bolsonaro government's education cuts. And The Guardian said it was tens of thousands of people. And then there was a pro-Bolsonaro protest. I mean, I could go on and on. But they created a false equivalency with this tiny pro-Bolsonaro protest that took place, as if it was the same size as the anti-ones. And then you got this clown, Tom Phillips, who John Pilger recently called a clown, who's their Latin American desk editor, just did a human interest article about the rise of far-right fascist hip-hop in Brazil by taking this guy out of nowhere who no one's ever heard of and acting like it's a growing trend of people on the periphery supporting Bolsonaro when Bolsonaro's popularity has dropped in half in the last 3 months. Right. So it's a shrinking trend. And it's definitely not connected to the hip-hop movement, because all of the big hip-hop artists are very anti-Bolsonaro.
Right. I mean, that piece just reeks of somebody who resents that he can't write Steve Bannon puff pieces. I mean, it was embarrassing to even look at. But I mean, I want to get. I mean, so, and I'll just preface this. This is actually important, and I will just I'll just sort of attempt to pre-clear a little bit of potential YouTube drama here, which really isn't the point. And I know that some people get very emotional about this stuff, and I'm sorry. This is actually a really important story. And we do have a couple of clips from, Jimmy Dore, who, look, obviously I've criticized him on several things, and I have a problem with some of the ways he does politics. I don't have a problem with his anger, and I don't have a problem with his rage at Democratic Party leaders or MSNBC. I have a problem with sloppy shit, and I have a problem with this way that, Matt said, it's like the word corruption is catnip to certain people. And if we start to look at globally, from Donald Trump, drain the swamp, to Narendra Modi, to Orban, to even Brexit, you have, and obviously in Bolsonaro, I mean, you have some of the most corrupt people on earth using corruption rhetoric to take aim either at, in my estimation, someone like Hillary Clinton, who is a thoroughly corrupted and terrible politician, but in fact, certainly objectively not as bad as Donald Trump, or, in fact, in Brazil, using it to delegitimize a party that and a government that, maybe in a different context, when Lula isn't a political prisoner and democracy isn't on hold, we can, have our critiques and analyze and so on, and that's fine. But in fact, an incredibly successful, honorable social democratic government. So, and the only reason we're doing this, and I'm sorry I'm taking so much time here, is, I haven't as of yet seen, Jimmy Dore circle back since The Intercept reporting on any of this stuff. So we're going to play two clips now. One is him sort of first just credulously accepting everything about Lava Jato.
I think the word would be propagated.
Propagating, absolutely. And then getting a question from one of his listeners. And by the way, you can look up. I wish that I was much stronger on this. It was, in fact, in some ways, basically just the beginning of my career doing this stuff. But in fact, I did oppose the coup and impeachment of Dilma. I wish I did more. I wish it was more aggressive. I wish I already knew Brian Mier. But if you have any type of even moderate left analysis, you could see what was going on. Anyways, we'll throw to Brian in a second, but we're going to play these two clips.
So they find people who fight corruption all over the world. It is really a heady experience to be there. It was. And Glenn Greenwald was the keynote speaker. And now I want to show you the nominees. So the first finalists for this prize are a group of lawyers from Brazil who are uncovering unbelievable amounts of corruption and winning. So let's watch. This is who they are.
Literally playing a Lava Jato propaganda video.
So they're called the Car Wash Task Force. And the reason why is because their investigation started with a money laundering operation that started in a car wash, but then it just expanded to almost the whole government. So there you go.
Lava Jato, it's okay for no corruption.
The Office soundtrack.
Lava Jato has become a work of art itself, with broad support of the public. Lava Jato bumper stickers are everywhere. Judge Morrow has become a folk hero, and Delton has a best-selling book on the operation.
I wrote this book to say that we are not heroes in this case, and car wash case is only the first step.
That's true.
Lava Jato is an attitude in Brazil now. It's a ray of hope, and it's an example for young prosecutors, young judges, that they can make a difference. We hope that we have success in the legal procedures, but the success of changing the mindset is already happening.
We live in a window of opportunity for changes, and we are committed to use any chance, any possibility to make things better in Brazil. And doing so is a matter that is up to everybody.
Jesus Christ, these visuals, if you're listening, you got to watch this.
Wow. That's kind of, I don't know, that's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I want to get a Lava Jato t-shirt.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I really want one.
So Lava Jato, that's car wash, I guess, in whatever. They speak Spanish, but I think they speak Portuguese, right? Portuguese in Brazil. So, yeah, Lava Jato. So there, we met those guys, by the way. I got to meet those guys. I interviewed them.
I mean, that's incredible. I mean...
All right, and now we'll go ahead and actually play. I know it's enraging, but we got to play this part because he got a question on it from somebody who, watches the show, obviously cares about this stuff. And, look, we all get things wrong from time to time.
OS says your report on Lava Jato, your report on Lava Jato is a spot on your record. You need to correct because who you praise jailed the best president Brazil has had in modern times. So Lava Jato, which I think is Spanish for car wash, they're a group of lawyers who followed corruption that started at a car wash, I think, and then they started exposing all the corruption inside the Brazilian government. And the Brazilian government pretty much ran on corruption, a lot of it. And they had a lot of lefty leaders. So Lava Jato ended up taking up, I think, the criticism of them. And actually, Glenn Greenwald spoke of the criticism of Lava Jato, but he also, applauded them for the work they did. And that he does have criticisms of them, but that ultimately they did expose corruption. So the rub against Lava Jato was that they only investigated lefties, and they didn't go after the right. I'm pretty sure that's the criticism of them. But I was covering Lava Jato as part of a human rights, anti-corruption, the Allard Prize, and they were nominated. So that's why I covered them.
Pause it. We should be investigating what the Allard Prize is. But anyways, Brian, to you.
Well, I know that, and I'm American. I've lived in Brazil 25 years. I had once a university student ask me, I told her I lived in Rio de Janeiro. I was at a DePaul University party in Chicago, and she said, Rio, I've always wanted to go there. How far is that from Acapulco? It's like, I get frustrated with, if you're going to report on something that's important for hundreds of millions of people, you might want to at least figure out what language they speak there.
Right.
Because he was confused about it the first time, and then the second time he just blew it. Like, he didn't even go back and verify what language they speak in Brazil. And beyond that, that just shows that what happened in my mind, someone just handed them some free material, and it's like, I don't have to plan a show this week. I'll just run this stupid video calling Lava Jato a work of art.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair opinion. Do you think, though, that just this anti-corruption thing is just so easy to get people into just having the laziest? Because you're right. I don't know. Maybe there was more work, but yeah, it seems like, you get invited to go to events. You don't know anything about the person, place, thing, or country. You talk to a group. You don't even, as an example, note that, oh, here's this, video about this major undertaking that involves billions of dollars in Brazil. There's no Afro-Brazilians in the video. That might be a signal if you have some type of left-oriented politics, potentially. And you don't have to be a big woke lord to notice that. That's just basic information.
And the country's 53% Afro-Brazilian.
Right.
So when you show a video it's not as bad as it would be if you showed something like that in the U.S. The U.S. is like 14%. Brazil's majority Afro-Brazilian.
Right. So, yeah, so how can we, I guess, how can we all do better on this? I guess it's obvious. If you had to break it out, obviously Wall Street Journal and so on, of course, they're the enemy of people. They're the sort of mouthpiece of corporations. Then there's, you said, the insidiousness of the Guardian and the New York Times. But what about, how, and then someone, ostensibly alternative and left, totally getting it wrong in this catastrophic way? How do you respond to those three lanes, basically?
Well, what I've noticed in this entire process, starting with the rebranding of Brazil from a winner nation to a loser nation before the World Cup until Lula's imprisonment and everything, is that there's a lot of corporations and corporate foundations and things financing left media. And there are these narratives that get built up in the left media or the alternative media that, even though they look like they're alternative to what the mainstream media is saying, there's a convergence where it actually is strengthening the mainstream media. So there was not just Jimmy Dore, I'm sorry, there was Bohr. That was Freudian.
Oh.
But
yeah.
But, there was this running narrative in the alternative media in the U.S. that everything that happened to Dilma Rousseff and Lula was due to their own inner failings of their party, as if Brazil existed in this geopolitical vacuum.
Right.
And this narrative acknowledged Lava Jato as something important, and it's time for the Brazilian left to be self-critical and admit that they have a problem with corruption, and, never challenging the narrative. But I think that what you should always do, if you consider yourself to be progressive or left or whatever you want to call it, is look at who's benefiting from this kind of stuff. You can't have a situation where the biggest beneficiaries are ExxonMobil, Chevron, Boeing, and big American companies are making a fortune but it's just naturally working out because this anti-corruption movement is so important. That it's just a side effect that the U.S. made so much money off of.
Right. And to be clear, we have no idea. I know that, Jimmy got to go to the Allard Prize thing. I certainly have no idea. And I think he just frankly just got it wrong and doesn't care to, circle back to it. And I think that it's just important. Regardless of any other drama and critique, if you're going to go out on this story, especially in light of what we see from The Intercept, there's an international obligation from solidarity. So whatever reason, I think in 2016, as an example, I think that I came on the right side of these things, but I think I gave way too much room towards a sort of like inward critique of PT versus a much broader strategic and historical view of what was actually taking place and the real stakes. You gotta go back and clean up after yourself.
The fact is, the PT is the largest leftist political party in the Western world.
Yes.
Yes. They got 40. They're ideologically to the left of Bernie Sanders. Okay. There's one internal faction of the PT, which is large, which is pretty much ideologically aligned with Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Socialists, which is led by Fernando Haddad, who got 44 million votes in the last presidential election. Okay, but the party itself is to the left of him.
Right.
To the left of that. They're farther left than the French Socialist Party or the Germans, Social Democrats or whatever. And so, of course, it's a big party, and there are problems with it, but that's not the central point. The central point is that a left-wing party managed to win 4 consecutive presidential elections, remove 40 million people from below the poverty line, completely restructure the higher education system, so that
this is one we don't even mention, but I think like what you said before. Move the government computer systems to open source software. That and obviously compared to the urgency of poverty and these other geostrategic questions can get lost, but that's actually another incredibly important progressive 21st century move. Brian, what do you anticipate the next couple of months, moving forward?
I just hope that Greenwald actually has some real bombastic stuff to release before the Supreme Court ruling on Lula, because what's happened is by letting these leaks out little by little, he's given all of this time for conservatives and international geopolitical interests to react and develop a strategy on how to belittle the stuff. And you see it in the way that once again, the Guardian and the New York Times are reporting that they're not emphasizing the sabotage of the elections and the way that the elections should be completely annulled, which is what Naomi Klein's calling for. They're emphasizing it's a personality issue. It's Glenn Greenwald. He's under attack now. Solidarity with Glenn Greenwald, or
of course, yes.
Moro. People are questioning Moro. These crazy Brazilians, but they're not talking about the fact that this is actual, proof that the election should be annulled. So little by little, there's the Jimmy Dore of law professors, some guy at Harvard who admitted that he's a personal friend of Dallagnol's and also that he doesn't speak Portuguese. He wrote this big blog article at Harvard last week saying the incredible shrinking Intercept case or something like that, just about how, I don't speak Portuguese, but I've talked to a lot of legal experts from Brazil. And I don't think they actually committed any crime.
Well, thank you, Professor. Deep
reporting.
Yeah.
Yeah, Harvard. So the right and capital, they're all building up their counter strategy for this. And I'm afraid if he doesn't come out with something really bombastic, it could just not, fizzle out. So I hope that he releases the audio and all this. I think he will, And everyone's really happy with him down here right now. But it's still hard to say whether Lula is going to be released from prison or not, because he's a political prisoner. His defense team has already proved that he was unjustly arrested and convicted.
Right.
And they didn't even need the Intercept links to prove. Moro illegally wiretapped the defense teams telephone system and used it to create strategies of, for their prosecution. Like in any other country in the world, he would be in jail and debarred.
Absolutely. Well, that's another Jeffrey Robinson. Look it up. Lula's international attorney was like, look, this case wouldn't fly in any other legal system. Brian Mier, I really appreciate your time as always. Brazil Wire and Telesur, thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me back on. Hopefully next time we talk, Lula will be a free man.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, man. All right, folks, we have to go to the GEM system, and then Harvey Kaye is going to join us. David, what do we got?
Well, we got a fun one. We're going to be talking about some of our favorite.
Ooh, that's what I like.
Our favorite friends over at Facebook. Yeah, we're going to be talking about Libra and this new digital currency. So
to help with connectivity.
Yeah, honestly. So Facebook is now pushing a new digital currency, and if you read their white papers and a lot of the stuff that's going on around it, they're really pitching it as a kind of cryptocurrency blockchain. But there's some issues even with that definition of what it is. But just so we can be on the same page, what Libra is going to be is it's going to be a digital currency that allows for people to be able to purchase goods and services online. So there's already a group of vendors that are going to be accepting Libra, like Spotify, for example. And the way it would work is that you would buy Libra and it would go into a digital wallet, which then you could use in any vendor that would accept it. Or you can exchange your Libra for the currency that you use. So if you bought it with US dollars, you could get it back for US dollars. Mm-hmm. So the reason it's very different than something like Bitcoin is that Libra is actually going to be backed by a basket of currencies. And this is where some of the stuff gets funny later. But that also means that it's not going to be as volatile as Bitcoin. It's going to be something that's actually going to be quite stable because it's going to be pegged. It's going to be backed by a reserve, and by its mandate, it has to be 100% reserve. So everything that Libra has to, they have to have a monetary value behind it. So where it gets interesting, though, is that they have what is called validator nodes, and these are basically the people who are the original investors. And to be a validator node, and to have voting rights on the Libra Association, which is basically going to be like the central bank of the Libra system, you have to invest $10 million up front. And already Spotify and a few other blockchain companies, a couple private investment firms, and notably Kiva, which is a microloan company, which we all know sort of gets into some shady practices in the third world, entrapping a lot of very desperate people into debts. That could be quite dangerous. Anyways, they're an early backer.
To
help with connectivity.
Right.
And of course, this being Facebook, there's this whole noble platform that they've been pushing. Predominantly, they've been talking about the 1.7 billion people who are unbanked and do not have access to financial services. So let's talk about that for a second, and also talk about how this is going to be making money for Facebook. The way that this works is that they're going to be taking in a huge basket of reserve currencies, and for all the money that's coming in, they're going to be basically putting that into a fund. So when you put money into the bank, you get interest on it. That's not going to be the case with Libra. If you have your money in Libra, Facebook and all these other companies are going to be extracting that interest rate. And when we're starting to talk about the potential for what Libra could be, that's going to be a significant amount of money. So when we're talking about these people who are currently unbanked, what they're offering for them is that they can participate in a system where they might be able to buy things online, but they will not have the services of a traditional bank, namely getting interest. Don't worry, they'll be taking care of the interest for them. On top of that, the real argument is that these are people living in economies where their currency fluctuates dramatically. Mm-hmm. And this is where we start to get into a major issue. If you're in an economy where people are taking out other money, it makes your currency even more volatile.
Right.
So in fact, we see a country that's already having an economic issue is now facing an absolute crisis where they're not even control of their own monetary policy. And of course, this being Facebook, people are very worried about privacy. Because this is going to be because if they're your bank, Facebook is going to be able to move from being able to guess what you like to buy to knowing what you'd like to buy.
Right.
Now, Facebook has created a separate entity that will be running their Libra for them, so there won't be direct control from Facebook to Libra. But even if you look at their white paper, consent is a very important thing. So I'm quoting now from the white paper on Libra.
Libra will not share account information or financial data with Facebook Incorporated or any third party without customer consent. And as we know from Facebook's history,
you could totally
getting that consent
take that one to the bank.
is a pretty good weasel word. So, you know, seriously, when we're talking about what's being developed is we're finding a way that, because the possibility of Libra is massive because they already do have so many people connected on a social network, that the potential for this being successful is, you know, somewhat high. You know, we'll see it's still a little ways away before they launch it, and governments are already looking into it because, you know, there's a few issues where it's like, does Facebook even have the legal right to be doing this? What they have is a license that they can sort of hold money to facilitate transactions. But basically what this is starting to look at like is like a basket of different currencies that is going to be rising and falling in value. That something seems very similar to like an ETF that's based on a basket of currencies. So there's going to be that issue. And then the last issue that we want to talk about is liquidity. So as we know from the financial crisis, liquidity is a massive issue. And if this becomes a currency that's being widely used, if there's any kind of financial instability where people start wanting their money not to be Facebook money, but they actually would like good old American dollars,
money,
right?
Money.
You're going to be into a situation where, you know, there could be a massive run. And this not being a bank that's backed by the Federal Reserve, if there is a run, what kind of responsibility does the global financial system, you know, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, have to this massive gamble? You know, so this could be something that could make any kind of massive shock in the global economy or even the digital economy much bigger than it naturally would be. So the last thing is this question of sovereignty, where we're just going to say it's like, what this is creating is a group where a few corporations are trying to create their own currency completely separate from government overreach or even any responsibility to any kind of democratic control from people. So we're talking about companies like Visa and Facebook being able to run their own money supply, and is that something that we're comfortable about being developed in the 21st century? Personally, I don't think that that's quite a good idea. At the same time, too, if we're going to be moving all of this value into something that's controlled by these very shady corporations that have history of abuse, do we want to be in a position where we might have to be bailing out these companies for their mistakes and their greed? You know, this is starting to look like, if it's successful, something that will be a cartel of elite corporations moving outside of government control, any kind of regulation, and any responsibility to the real economy, to the people, or to democratic society.
I just love the balls of them actually doing like 2014 Silicon Valley speak. It's like, guys, even just on a PR level, that ship has sailed.
Oh, yeah.
You guys are not trusted. Even wine moms who are freaked out about Trump get that you people are scumbags and structurally dangerous to our society.
It's so cynical, too, to use the poor, like the severely poor in this world, as a shield for, you know, to basically create this massive profit.
Well, there's a huge, I mean, that just goes back to, I mean, this was huge in the Clinton and Obama worlds of micro loans, the unbanked billion. There were Peruvian and Indian economists. I think it was Hernando de Soto was a Peruvian economist who was just give poor people property rights. That's the big answer to everything. Get them into property relationships. I mean, to the extent, and I don't, you know, obviously they're very ideologically malleable, and there is a lot of extreme right-wing politics in Silicon Valley. But to the extent that these companies really are just like a product of neoliberal Democrats, this is the branding and the strategy is totally on point from where that world comes from. All right. Thank you, Dave. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Harvey J. Kaye on The Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to The Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is returning champion Harvey J. Kaye. Harvey, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
How's it being back in the city?
Muggy.
It is muggy as hell, huh?
Muggy.
What is it like in Wisconsin this time of year?
Probably wet, but not quite this muggy.
I've never been.
Actually, the weekend was kind of nice, and yesterday was kind of nice, actually. But today was just brutal.
Today is super brutal.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. But you should be in a good mood. There's been some good things happening from the Harvey Kaye side of things.
Yeah, no, things are good. Absolutely.
Yeah, we got to talk about. Let's just get. I want to get to it. I mean, obviously this speech happened a couple of weeks ago, but we need to talk about it with you.
Yeah, this was phenomenal.
Bernie Sanders. Well, let's get right to it. Let's play a clip of it. This is him echoing my favorite FDR line. We have actually two great clips. One is from the speech, and then another one from FDR himself that we'll actually get to. This is Bernie Sanders on welcoming their hatred.
Like today, the quest for transformative change was opposed by big business, by Wall Street, by the political establishment, by the Republican Party, and by the conservative wing of FDR's own Democratic Party. And he faced the same scare tactics then that we experience today: red baiting, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. In a famous 1936 campaign speech, Roosevelt stated, and I quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering." They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. And Roosevelt concluded, and I quote, "Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred."
Suck it. What did you think, Harvey? What did you think when you saw that, and what was the context for when Roosevelt said it?
If I'm not mistaken, that was a Madison Square Garden speech in October 36. And okay, so in 32 he won the presidency. He launches the New Deal, ran into some troubles in 1934, and yet the Democrats took an even greater number of seats in Congress. He was extremely popular. Okay, extremely popular, except, as you can imagine, among the corporate interests. And the wealthiest Americans, who had actually in some ways looked forward possibly to an FDR presidency because they assumed prohibition would come to an end.
Right.
Now, why did they want prohibition to come to an end? They drank all they wanted during the 20s.
Money. There's business opportunity,
exactly.
right? Sure.
Well, and they figured they would tax working people for every beer, and they wouldn't have to pay income taxes. That was the expectation.
Bloomberg politics of the
Pretty
30s.
much,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So what happens? And so so they organized something called the American Liberty League. The American Liberty League spent millions of dollars on radio, on what used to be called film strips, on newspaper ads, in every venue, in order to undermine or weaken the Roosevelt administration. They failed. They failed because they could never get a grassroots movement going. And so, but nevertheless, they spent a lot of money. Moreover, they were hoping to pull the Southern white supremacists into a coalition with Father Coughlin's group. And basically what would happen is...
Explain Father Coughlin to
So
people.
Father Coughlin was a priest born in Canada, but he had a church in Royal Oak, Michigan, I believe it was.
Another one of the reactionary imports from Canada.
Jesus. Canada has a lot to answer for, frankly. I didn't know he was from it, too, but now we've got
Some of our friends, I'm
Coughlin
sure some of our friends
from
are upset by what we're saying right now, but screw that.
Well, they should apologize to us
Absolutely.
if you're upset. Think of how upset we are.
They knew the rich that Roosevelt would not lose the election unless they could figure out a way to split the Democratic vote. So they eagerly anticipated a third-party effort of
Huey Long.
Of Father Coughlin's group, and of these Southern white supremacist forces.
And Father Coughlin was sort of like he was the prototype of like a a fascist, populist anti-Semite,
Yes,
basically.
right. And had he not been born in Canada, he might actually have. Sorry, and it's not inconceivable. He would have been even more directly himself involved in politics, but he was born in Canada.
But he was a radio show, host, right?
That was his vast following, absolutely vast following. So the hope was that they could cultivate this. They even had a movement going in the South, which I think it was called the grassroots movement, something like that. And in fact, the third party did emerge, but it never emerged on the basis that the rich had hoped for. By the way, the racism and the anti-Semitism that was propagated at the grassroots was just, I mean, we couldn't even use the language that they were using. Okay.
Would you give us a little tutorial on Huey Long? What should we think of Huey Long?
I'm not a fan of Huey Long.
I have a soft spot for Huey Long, of course.
Well, I lived in Louisiana.
Called himself the Karl Marx of the hillbillies. That's a great line.
Okay. So Huey Long, the Long family was from northern Louisiana.
Kids suck.
Okay.
Yes,
yeah.
I know that.
So they were from northern Louisiana, which
Right.
was basically more of the Scotch-Irish who were up there, as opposed to the Catholic Cajuns who were in the South and African Americans who were more numerous in the South. And they were populists, and Huey Long was a populist, but he was a populist with dictatorial ambitions. And though he was willing to confront publicly the oil interests, there were a lot of very corrupt dealings. And he postured as the savior of working people. Okay, he was going to share the wealth. That was the idea. Nevertheless, he operated as a dictator. The only thing that I kind of welcomed when I learned more about him myself was the fact that I was at Louisiana State University for my PhD, and they talked about that he did invest in the university because he really wanted a big marching band.
You never know why great things are. So when you
he was assassanated in 1935, so he could not run for president.
So who ran the race?
I knew I was coming up, and I'm blanking, but it was an upper Midwestern Plains political figure who did actually run that time.
So when you saw that speech by Bernie, and I don't want to get into all of the I think there's interesting historical debates that we can have about this one way or another, and I think we've actually done it really well on this show.
We have, yeah.
But just what I thought was brilliant, and I think what was so pathetic, frankly, in so many of the responses to Bernie's speech that sought to minimize it or disconnect his argument from this broader history, which we could just as easily pivot to A. Philip Randolph and Eugene Debs
Sure.
and all of these
Walter Reuther,
MLK, Thomas Paine, Emma Goldman. I mean, this is a very rich history,
Absolutely.
obviously. So what? But that. And the Jacobin had a great piece, though, saying, like, look, for all of the pedants saying that, well, the attack that was marshaled most against the speech was, and I thought it was incredible because Bernie actually covered this in the speech, which is that both people who are, I might have very close politics to, but are frankly just sort of posturing online of, well, Bernie's socialism speech wasn't like the communique from like the Cuban Central Committee, so it's bullshit. Or the people who are, this is nonsense, and Roosevelt was a Democrat and Bernie's a crackpot and so on. The Jacobin piece pointed out that, well, whatever you think, and in fact, I think that obviously it was some form of social democracy. I wouldn't call it socialism, but the people who called it socialist and first tried to weaponize socialism against FDR were the contemporary oligarchs of FDR trying to destroy the New Deal, which Bernie hit in his speech. Bernie had all of the quotes of the reactionaries of his time, and even the Truman quote saying, look, everything good that we've done in this society has always been tarred as being socialism. He covered it himself.
You brought up Truman. Harry Truman grabbed hold of the second Bill of Rights, the Economic Bill of Rights that FDR proposed. Truman called for national health care.
Yes.
Truman launched a committee to actually push civil rights.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll just start with that. I'm not a defender of everything.
We can't. I mean, this is obviously we're in the prototype of the Johnson one, which is like, look, I get it.
Yeah, right.
Still committed genocide.
Right.
We can't overlook that one.
Let's not go there right now.
Okay.
Well, we don't need to. What we need to know.
But I want to talk about the Bernie speech.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me start off with this statement.
Yes.
FDR called himself a liberal, but he was decidedly a social democrat.
Mm-hmm.
Bernie calls himself a democratic socialist, but the campaign that he's running is a social democratic one. Does it fucking matter?
No. Absolutely
Exactly.
not. And I say that as 100% socialist. I say it as somebody who absolutely agrees with Bhaskar Sunkara that fundamentally you need to push capital back enough to make these things durable. But in the context of 2019 and what he's putting on the table, it is an extraordinary step forward. And also, again, it's not just better. And where I do want to emphasize the socialist terms, I do think with things like just getting rid of student debt, not a program that we're tinkering around with, no matter how well, no matter how progressively, but this big, bold stuff, that makes him not just the best candidate, but actually a different thing. He's a different item.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is to smack at those who would say he's not socialist enough. Let's put it this way. The fact is that we have got to resecure the narrative. And we're not going to secure it by arguing for some kind of socialist revolution. That's ridiculous. Okay? What we will do is, however, if by way of Bernie Sanders, we can take back America or take back the public realm, we can not only improve the lives of a hell of a lot of people, we can not only start pulling out of the marketplace certain essential goods that people need not to be poor, not to be desperate, not to be on the street homeless. Guarantee everyone a job who wants to have a job. This would radically transform the world in which we live in. And the third thing is, doing so, we will show the degree to which small d, democratic public sector and government is a radical shift. And then we can start talking about, what do we do about the banks? What do we do about the big corporations?
Well, I quoted last week in the commentary Marx's endorsement of a, people know, again, the critique of the Gotha program is the really important confrontation with the limits of reforms inside capitalism. That's important. But then conversely, he endorses a French political program that it's equal wages for men and women, shorter workday, union protections, precisely the same types of horizon expanding reforms that we're talking about.
Right.
That's Marx.
Look,
I mean, for those that are, look, and I take Marx very seriously myself. It's right there.
I'm not in this for socialism. I'm a socialist, but I'm not in it for socialism. I'm in it for greater freedom, greater equality, greater democracy. And Bernie is the vehicle to make that happen. I have no reservations in saying that. It would be nice if there was it would be nice if we were back in, say, 1938.
For some people.
Sorry. Where we didn't have to make an argument. My point is, where we didn't have to make an argument for that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But right now, we have got to show the vast majority of Americans that working people and poor people's lives can be made better, not by trickle down and not by, what the fuck is that thing called, Libra?
Oh yeah, Libra.
And by the way,
can we take that as a sound drop, please?
And by the way,
what the fuck is that thing called? Libra?
Yeah,
that was great. I love it.
My birthday is October 9th. I'm a Libran. I am so pissed off that I have the audacity to do that.
Oh yeah, Harvey Kaye, another astrology promoter. Hell yeah. Fuck you, nerds. No, shh. We're in on the astrology together. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, right. No, yeah. So to come back to Bernie's speech, you know that for years I've been looking for Bernie to really lay claim to the FDR legacy. Okay?
Yes.
Not to take us back to the New Deal, but to take us beyond the New Deal, to revive the legacy and the tradition.
Right.
And I also believe that there are young people who are pursuing it, AOC and other folks. She was very good when she first went to Washington. In the interview with Anderson Cooper or somebody else trying to lay claim to Lincoln and FDR. That's great. But Bernie is the elder statesman of the left.
Right.
He's the one who can speak in some ways from experience, having come through, he's a good 10 years older than I am. But the fact is that he can talk of history. And look, 4 years, I wish it were 4 years, 2016, the fact is that vast majority of young people embrace Bernie Sanders.
Absolutely.
And the degree to which he can speak of these things as not only something seemingly hip, but something historical that you do not only to honor the past, but in order to make the future progressively democratic. I mean, this was a great moment.
Can I just say really briefly for hip watchers and viewers, and forgive me, but this is an important analogy. Look, I mean, there's a reason that Chavez centered Bolivar in everything he did. I mean, he said it was 21st century socialism, and it was this radical new thing for Venezuela, a thing that I absolutely under Chavez defend. He retrieved Bolivar to center it. He said it was a continuity of a classic revolutionary figure that has universal respect in Venezuela and across Latin America to a great extent. So the idea that you would, as a political candidate, leave that legacy on the table. And I could tell you, definitely, to validate you, anecdotally, even, my friend David Feldman, who has a brilliant podcast, which you should be on sometime. I love David Feldman's show, and I love being on his show.
He's funny.
He's funny. He's incredibly smart. And so this is actually a really good example, because this is a very well-read, this guy, has read Marx and stuff, no matter how much he'll kind of joke about himself. He's a very well-read guy. And I went to this move because I said, he asked me about the socialist thing. And I said, look, there's no doubt that my horizon is socialist. And I'm committed to the Richard Wolff Project as an example. I want to democratize the economy. I think that is morally and strategically essential. And I said, and part of what's going on here, and certainly with Bernie, is we're just talking about completing and revolutionizing and updating the New Deal.
Right.
And he goes, oh, okay, I get that. The idea that you wouldn't use that as a political instrument to forward this to win is frankly political malpractice. I think you bring Bernie other things. I think people should be talking about things, frankly, we could learn from the Workers' Party, as an example. I think there could be, not just Scandinavia, but in Americas, frankly.
Look,
but you got to use that. It's crazy you wouldn't use that.
What really pissed off Norman Thomas, the socialist, the leader of the Socialist Party in the 30s, about FDR, was that FDR was taking everything from the Socialist Party and applying it on a grander scale because the Democrats could do that under Roosevelt.
Right.
And the other thing is, look, in 1932, when Roosevelt was running for president, he called for a new economic declaration of rights for the forgotten man. In 1941, which is basically the basis for my book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, he lays out this vision of freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and then freedom from want and freedom from fear. Now, if that isn't as radical as you can get, I don't know what to say.
If you follow that, to me, it's like, look at Eleanor Roosevelt and creating look, the UN in practice, okay, there's all these problems, it's beholden to superpowers and so on. If you don't think even just that what was put forward, especially because I think, to me, she was an incredible political figure, obviously, in of herself, and very sympathetic to anti-colonial movements and the power from the beginning of anti-colonial presence in the UN. Just to loop back to that, even putting forward something like a Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a concept, as a North Star, is revolutionary. And of course, if you took the Four Freedoms seriously as something that should be implemented across the planet, you would have a radically different world system.
And then FDR,
you'd have no WTO.
And 3 years later, from 41 to 44, FDR takes the next step and he calls for an economic Bill of Rights, which is what Bernie has basically taken and turned to a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. And by the way, Martin Luther King in 1965 proposed an economic Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, which was basically because he felt that under he had optimism, the Great Society would address a lot of people's needs, but he wanted to make sure that these were not just programs, that they came to be considered rights. A. Philip Randolph offered a freedom budget, with the total amount of which at the time it was huge, today would not be viewed as huge, which was specifically to end freedom from want in America. There were those
Talk about A.
moments.
Philip Randolph a little bit. I've talked about him on this show with Adolph Reed, if you go back. Incredibly important figure.
Absolutely, truly incredible. One of the greats of the 20th century. So A. Philip Randolph was, ever since had begun in the 1920s, he became the head of, the president, I think was the title, of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which, by the way, was not just a black union. It was a black union that had communications all over the country, because these were the guys who were on the Pullman cars that were traveling the country. These guys could get off in any city they had to get off in and basically organize and mobilize. So
can I just give a random, just to illustrate this? There's a book. I read this literally when I was a kid. It's probably one of the first books I ever read, called The Delaney Sisters' First 100 Years. They were a pair of African-American sisters. I grew up in the South, and they were among many siblings, and they ended up in New York, and they both happened to live to over 100 years old. So they ended up getting this book contract, but one of them was like, I think, the first African-American woman dentist in Brooklyn, I think. The other, they had these, but their lives charted everything from the apartheid Jim Crow South to the Great Migration. And so I understood one of their brothers was a Pullman porter.
Yeah.
And explaining the power of that union and the significance in African-American political organizing of that was mind-blowing, even as a kid.
Absolutely. And the best example I can give you, and let's also note that A. Philip Randolph was a socialist with a capital S, and the head of the labor union, and he took that labor union into the AFL, American Federation of Labor. Some people felt he should have broken and moved to the later CIO, but he stuck with them because they had taken in this black union to begin with. Okay, so in 1941, when Roosevelt gave the Four Freedoms speech, Randolph heard the speech and treated it as a moment to mobilize a march on Washington, with the idea of demanding the desegregation of the defense industries, and also possibly the desegregation of the U.S. military and the Jim Crow segregation of the U.S. military. And he decided that they were going to take to D.C. Originally, the thought was 10,000 African Americans, and no whites were to be in the march. This was going to be self-liberation, we'll call it, okay? And in order to get this revved up, he sent his Pullman Union brothers around the country to organize in black churches, black local chapters, fraternal organizations, and they held pretty sizable gatherings and protests in places like Chicago in preparation for what would be a late June or July march in Washington. Now, FDR heard that. And he said, well, he's a little worried. He wasn't worried about A. Philip Randolph and the marchers. He was worried about what whites in D.C. might do, because it was a segregated city. Right. Wilson had segregated the District of Columbia.
Great villain. We have to talk about that great villain someday.
Someday. Yeah. Okay. So he asked Eleanor to negotiate with A. Philip. He had already been to the White House, Randolph. But the fact was he asked Eleanor, who was on really good terms with Randolph, to negotiate, to talk him out of bringing them to Washington. And I can't help but imagine that when Eleanor went, she didn't try to dissuade him from it.
I would imagine not.
Okay,
yes.
And Randolph was pretty much convinced that once he got to the White House, which is what Roosevelt did, he invited him to the White House to talk about it. He was pretty much convinced there was no way that Roosevelt would bring him to the White House if he wasn't going to do something.
Right.
So in some ways, it was kind of like a theater moment, theatrical moment.
Sure.
And they're there, and he goes with Walter White to the White House. Walter White was the head of the NAACP. And Roosevelt asked, basically, how is it true you intend to bring this march to D.C.? This is as the story's told. And Randolph says, yeah. And Roosevelt says to him, well, how many are you planning to bring? And in his head, he was expecting to hear 10, 20,000. And Randolph, knowing the theatrical moment, said 100,000.
Right.
Which then did make Roosevelt sit back a bit and say, we really ought to do something. We ought to bring. So he signed the executive order ordering the creation of the Fair Employment Practice Commission, and basically this was the beginning of the desegregation of the defense industries. Now, Randolph said when he left, he wrote to a relative and said, I knew I was going to get something. There was just no question in his mind. But this is the Randolph who later,
Jobs and Justice.
And in 1940s, he called upon African Americans to boycott the U.S. military until it was desegregated, and Truman signed the order of desegregation. Right. Later, Randolph and Bayard Rustin together are the masterminds, and Rustin's the organizer of the March on Washington, which is for jobs. And basically, as you know, it was an economic and political march, which was enabled. And this is something
Adolph Reed, if I understand him correctly from our conversation, it's end American apartheid and Jim Crow, and then democratize the New Deal,
right?
So that social democracies for everybody.
And
in the
wake
States.
of the
and that's the battle we're still fighting.
Absolutely. And in the wake of that march is when Randolph begins to draw up his freedom budget. Now, the other interesting thing is in all of this is that what really enables the 250,000 people to turn out in D.C. is not only the determination of blacks and whites who are supporters of the struggle, but also the fact that Walter Reuther and the UAW underwrote the price of the buses to move people to D.C. Now, something else I'll just note, which is we all know the March on Washington in 1963 for the Martin Luther King speech, but I want to note that in 1944, I believe it was, Randolph spoke at Morehouse College in Atlanta, and King was like a precocious 15-year-old undergraduate there. And according to his own statement, it's Randolph who helps radicalize King.
Yes.
So here it's like then King is the one who gives the great speech in D.C. I mean, it's this.
There's also the global connection with some of the garb in that, the white in that. Also, I think actually traces back to King's interest in the Congress Party in India, which is another fascinating
yes.
part of it.
Well, of course, yeah. We could go.
But
so
I want
to.
Yeah. So this is great, and so let's juxtapose these two things because we're going to talk a little bit more in the post game about, and now a little bit about Joe Biden, the history of the DLC, the Democratic Party, the wrong parts of the Democratic Party. But this is Third Way, which Malika Jabali just tweeted out, regular on our show. She just said, are they just embracing becoming a parody account? And so...
Yeah, right. Now, that is a damn good question.
Yeah, right. And so their response to, this incredible proposal by Sanders that would just, the net positive impact on tens of millions of lives. They say free college for all is regressive. Blanket debt forgiveness could actually increase inequality. Of course, Brianna Joy Gray has pointed out actually that student debt actually, of course, as all these other things, is hugely racialized in terms of its disproportionate effects. I want to couple this tweet though with this sound because John Hickenlooper, we won't even play what Hickenlooper said. He's irrelevant. He's a joke. But what was wonderful was that Hickenlooper tweeted some nonsense about socialism to the Bernie Sanders account. And again, following the Harvey J. lead, I don't know if you saw this. This is what the Bernie account tweeted back at him, this clip. I want you to juxtapose this with the Third Way of today.
Let me warn you, and let me warn the nation against the smooth evasion that says, of course we believe these things. We believe in social security. We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all these things. But we do not like the way the present administration is doing them. Just turn them over to us. We will do all of them. We will do more of them. We will do them better. And most important of all, the doing of them will not cost anybody anything.
It's just beautiful. They literally, again, I won't even dignify. Hickenlooper is such a waste of all of our time, but the only purpose Hickenlooper served in public life was for the Bernie social media team to retrieve that clip.
One of the other yo-yos running for the Democratic, whose name I'm blanked on, who's the governor of, is it Colorado? Or is that Hickenlooper?
Oh, no. No.
Oh,
Yes.
Bennett. No, it's Bennett I'm thinking of.
Bennett's a senator from Colorado.
Okay.
Can you imagine you have two fucking boring right-wing Democrats from Colorado with absolutely no charisma, no geographic, no identity.
You would have thought
legalizing
marijuana would have made them more interesting, right?
Right.
No, but he apparently today on Twitter he issued, or in a speech, he issued his own 4 freedoms.
Oh my God.
The first of which has something to do with the right to the freedom to rise up. Which as in upward mobility, not like rise up.
Right,
but,
I understand. Yeah,
I can't even remember the others.
Meritocracy
right,
lie.
Absolutely.
Well, so then maybe actually can you though, because actually that we roll our eyes at it, but that's the central organizing theology of Carter, Dukakis, Clinton, Obama. Not to mention a really odious figure like Joe Biden.
If you carry it through, look, one after the other, right? Yes. So you can go Carter, even Mondale, people,
Mondale was running an austerity budget on middle and lower income tax increases. How is it? This is going to fight the vicious assault on working people of the Reagan era?
Right. Dukakis as a candidate. Right. And then Clinton, correct? And then, who do we have in, who lost? Gore. Al Gore. Now, if you follow that all the way through, what you've got basically is, in the Carter case, what we call the New Democrats. Capital N, capital D, right? Then you go, in the wake of it in 1984, the creation of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, right? And they're committed to what later is called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as an idea is already floating. It's embodied in the Washington Monthly magazine, and these candidates thereafter are basically products of or members of the Democratic Leadership Council. And it's basically it's to take Carter's austerity budgets, is to take, I'm using his words, austerity, liberate business, okay, deregulate transportation, finance, and I'm forgetting the third one. But it's this constant drumbeat. Remember, I may be the only one who was alive at the time, but this begins in 1978. That's 40 years ago. And for 40 years, the Democratic Party has pursued that kind of politics and policies and programs. And in fact, it haunts the Democratic Party. Because whatever Obama may or may not have been able to become, the fact is with Biden as his vice president, and I'm pretty sure it was Biden who encouraged him to put everything on the table when it became necessary to negotiate with the Republicans.
Talk about that story. This is very important.
Okay.
There's so many things rightly to attack Biden on. If you care about civil rights, foreign policy, women's rights, corporate issues, everything he's bad on. But one thing that gets less attention is that in 2010, 2011, the Obama administration, under the strategic guidance of Joe Biden,
that's right,
puts massive cuts in Social Security and Medicare on the table.
On the table.
The only reason it doesn't go through is because Republicans are so fanatical. They won't accept the 75% win.
Right. They will not give Obama any kind of victory, even when it would be a victory that would put him in the toilet with the rest of the Democratic base.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is Joe Biden's
And this is Joe Biden's encouragement. Right. And to imagine in the wake of the Hillary Clinton fiasco that the Democratic, well, look, the Democratic power base, the money power, basically.
The people colluded,
Okay.
the people sitting around in rooms strategizing ways to destroy Bernie Sanders. Yep.
Money power, the columnists in the New York Times and elsewhere, okay, who are so eager to marginalize Bernie Sanders, to efface him from the campaign. And why? Because 2016 scared them. Really did scare them. If there had not been a Clinton machine, Bernie Sanders might well have won the Democratic nomination. And we wouldn't have gotten through the nightmare of the past 2 years of the Trump administration. Right now, we'd be talking about whether or not we really do want to pursue every one of Bernie's plans, as opposed to talking about how the fuck do we get out of this mess?
As opposed to torturing children being a regular part of our news cycle.
Right. Every single day, another atrocity is reported.
I want to revisit that. We had a fascinating conversation the first time you came on the appropriate use of the word fascism.
Oh, yeah.
And, I think we all sort of settled on barbarism. I mean, I'm a strong defender of the use of the word concentration camps, because that is literally what they are.
No, absolutely. There's a difference between concentration camps and death camps.
Precisely.
Right. Yeah.
And people are getting, and this is what they are. The dictionary definition includes in categories. One category is refugees. I mean, this is what they're doing.
Yeah, right. So you were raising the question of, is this fascism or not? No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't need to spend that much time on it, but I feel very comfortable using that word.
I don't yet.
You don't yet.
I don't yet. And the reason I understand why it would feel good to use it.
Yeah.
And I think I have along the way.
I think you have. I've seen you. Yes.
Right. But it's the case that we'll know when fascism hits us. You and I will not be sitting here talking about it.
True.
Okay,
True.
That's my point.
True.
I just think there's fascists that exist and there's authoritarians. Robert Paxton, who has the book The Anatomy of Fascism, makes a distinction between authoritarians and fascists. And fascism is when you realize that you're going to need to mobilize your reactionary right-wing base and you get them involved. So I look at a lot of, frankly, media people, I think, are fascists. They're trying to, agitate about transgender people, or or mask over the concentration camps, because they're trying to maintain that momentum. And then you also have, I think, the Republicans are maybe more. I think they're fascist sympathetic, but I think they're more authoritarian. They'd rather not deal with the sort of demos, even if it is reactionary, than some of the more fascists are.
Well, it's an interesting question, just really quickly, though, because if it's not until it's implemented. So, because I just want to say, Well, just to introduce briefly, like, okay, Trump's an authoritarian. That's undoubted. The Republican Party's authoritarian. But then in Brazil, Bolsonaro is literally, he served as a young man in the regime that they coined the term neo-fascism for. Now, Brazil, fortunately, still has a thriving and energetic opposition, so people still can do this. However, it is under control, I think, of an objectively fascist
And you know what
leader.
it is? So Matt, there's fascist politics, but then there's a fascist state.
Right.
And given you guys are even more theoretically oriented than I am, that's an important distinction.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. I agree. Well, we could just call it barbarism and concentration camps and grotesque and
I still like the word.
Just,
look, the Republican Party is reactionary.
Yes.
It is so reactionary that.
Would you say authoritarian too?
They're willing to use authoritarian means to pursue their reactionary goals.
I think it's authoritarian to deny women an ability to have basic sovereignty over their body. I think, across on a state level, they've passed, serious bills to criminalize dissent and protest.
Sorry, don't get me. No, look, the currents that run through that Republican Party, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. We're splitting hairs in some ways.
Sure, no, but it's interesting. Or interesting to split.
Look, in Kansas, there were guys who tried to introduce bills that would have disabled professors from speaking truth to power and even to their own students.
Right.
It's what we're witnessing right now, and this is why what Matt said is important, is the possibility, and I think this is what we're really seeing with I wish I had a keychain here. What we're seeing is Trump every so often dangling the fascist politics.
Right.
Okay? Like mobilizing certain kinds of forces that we tend to associate with, Aryan Nation in the past and folks like that. He dangles that threat.
Oh, always.
Right?
Regularly.
Yeah.
Regularly. And shares, I think, many of their ideological views. Okay, folks, we got to go to the post game. We have to talk about what's happening with Iran. We're going to start with a debunk with Ben Burgess. Some more really good sound, obviously. We're going to take your questions. We've got a whole bunch to get to. Become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. Find all of the ways that you can find the great Harvey J. Kaye's work, who has a book coming out pretty soon from my publisher.
Yep.
From my publisher.
Well, in fact, I want to give Michael credit. It was Michael who introduced me to his publisher.
Indeed. That's my pleasure and honor. I'm excited for people to read that book.
We should say Zero Books.
Zero Books. What's the name of your book?
Take Hold of Our History.
Take Hold of Our History.
Make America Radical Again.
Against the Web. Cosmopolitan Socialist Answer to the IDW and the New Right. We'll see you in the postgame. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate you all.